Before I introduce the panel, just want to give a quick backgrounder. We want to talk a little bit about some of the way that this industry is evolving and how it's evolving along with the communities that are going to be vital in its growth. So the U.S. has tremendous resources when it comes to spurring new technologies. As Mark Peters and the Senator mentioned, we have world-class R&D infrastructure. We've got a strong entrepreneurial culture. We have a very active venture capital sector. And all of those things have helped spur, for advanced nuclear, the launch of 70-plus projects across the country. However, those attributes, while they might be great at inspiring and nurturing some early-stage innovation, aren't necessarily what's going to help get technology deployed. There are a lot of challenges that still need to be addressed. Especially if those projects that we're talking about have high upfront capital costs. They're large, they're complex. So on our last panel, we discussed how the sector could engage more with individual communities at the local level to start getting that initial round of projects built. In this panel, I want to talk about how we move to the next step and how we scale that up into a thriving national industry for advanced nuclear. We have a panel of some experts who I'm very excited about because each of them offers a unique perspective, and each of them has been watching how technology sectors like advanced nuclear can make that leap into a scaled-up industry. And they each bring pretty unique insights about a very important community that's going to play a big role in that process, and that would be the investment community. So I'm very excited to welcome our panel. First, we have Rachel Pritzker, who is the founder and president of the Pritzker Innovation Fund. We also have Simon Irish, who is CEO of Terrestrial Energy, a Gen 4 company. Zach Bogue, who is a co-founder and co-managing partner for a venture capital firm, Data Collective, and Johanna Wolfson, who is representing Prime, the Prime Fund, Prime Impact Fund, excuse me, which is an organization that helps direct philanthropic capital toward climate breakthroughs. So very excited to have all of you here. And just to kick off, we can maybe start with Rachel. You've been an early ambassador for advanced nuclear to a lot of different communities. And sometimes the first person that people have heard about advanced nuclear from.
I'm very popular at cocktail parties.
Exactly. Oh, here she comes. I wonder what she's going to talk to us about. But some of those communities that you have reached out to are in the investment space or have the potential to be. So that includes, potential investors in the VC world or philanthropy. What I'm curious about is, as the technologies have developed, and this movement has been getting more momentum, what changes have you noticed in those cocktail party conversations or those boardroom conversations? How has the response changed over the past few years?
I guess, well, I would definitely say those conversations have gotten easier. For one thing, when I would even broach this subject at all, maybe 3-4 years ago, not only was it something no one had heard of, but it was something no one wanted to hear about. I think that is definitely changing, both in the philanthropic and the investment communities. And I just have to say that a lot of that is because of the work done by groups like Third Way and other partners also represented here, like the Breakthrough Institute and Clean Air Task Force, and many others who were able to take a conversation that really wasn't happening and make sure it was something people couldn't ignore anymore. So definitely due to some of that work, it's gotten easier. I would also say that climate math has made it tougher to ignore, just sort of basically what we're facing as the conversation has gotten more serious and more detailed about what it will actually take, not just to power the U.S., but the whole world, and not just to address the energy sector, but as you heard in the other panels, other sectors also. The math has made it tough to ignore. And then, honestly, the politics. If you're only going to if your only solution you're offering is renewables and efficiency, in this political climate, it makes it much tougher to have any climate conversation. So I think in that way, it has gotten easier. There still are a lot of challenges, and certainly there are obviously people who still really believe that wind and solar and efficiency are all it's going to take, and so they don't want to have a conversation that's not in those buckets. And I think that's partly just personal and historical histories of not supporting nuclear, primarily in the sort of philanthropic environmental space. And for investors, it is hard to get buy-in on a technology that you don't have a test case to point to. And particularly because the sort of pro-technology, innovation-focused investors, they often are really put off by an industry that requires so much government interaction, that requires approvals and siting and sort of all this interaction that honestly, they're used to doing things in their garage. So I think that's it's a challenge. So finding a way to convince either whether it's because you have something to point to as an example that's made it through that process, or by the work groups like Third Way and its partners are doing to help clear some of those barriers to the marketplace. Honestly, I think that's one of the most useful things we can do to help attract private capital.
Thanks. And so even if it's not necessarily a demonstration reactor, do some of the milestones that we know in this community, in advanced reactor world, that are huge regulatory milestones that might not make front page news, do those help? Do those help when you're talking to investors who might not be necessarily embedded in the details of this industry? And Simon, feel free to jump in as well. I know, of course, you've spoken to all types of investors over the years. Does that help to have progress in the industry, the type of progress that we're having now?
Well, absolutely. I mean, when I first came to Washington for an advanced reactor conference, the conference consisted of individuals. They were representing themselves. They weren't, as far as I can recall, representing companies. If you go to an advanced reactor conference today, the people who attend are representing companies. And that is, I think, indicative of a very significant change in market industrial context. So the advanced reactor companies and the technologies they're looking to develop I would say, represents a new industrial technology asset class, which has, I think, very important implications for those in the investment management industry. In the investment management industry, you recognize the world's uncertain. You recognize that if you are to participate optimally in future outcomes, you need a diversified portfolio. And I think what is significant about what industry has achieved over the last 5 to 6 years is that it can make a case at the institutional level that nuclear innovation, that nice future that was discussed by Susie Jarowski a few moments ago, that future must be part of a balanced portfolio, of a portfolio allocation in that balanced portfolio. I think that's very significant. But just one comment in terms of investor outreach, something that hasn't changed, and that is investors remain, I think, broadly skeptical about nuclear innovation. That's a healthy thing. Investors are generally skeptical, full stop. And the task for the industry, the task for the company that I represent, is making the case that there is today a tremendous and enormous opportunity. If you start opening a spreadsheet and trying to put numbers on that opportunity, it is extraordinarily impressive. I mean, this is the opportunity to take nuclear to the next chapter. This is the opportunity for nuclear innovation to play a very significant role in global industrial heat and power provision. And that is the largest industrial activity of the lot. That's 10 times larger than defense than the economic activities in defense and aerospace, which is the next largest major industrial activity. So I think the task is to bring that message, that very, very exciting message to investors, and it takes time. There's a bit of history with the nuclear industry. I would say it has not had a healthy relationship with private capital. That's the point where you start. And it's not the best place to start with any innovative technology, because at the beginning of your first meeting, you are in a disadvantaged position. But I think once you do engage with investors, and you have the opportunity of getting them over the hump, that there could be an extraordinary opportunity here, then you're in a much stronger position. But that opportunity to engage with investors, Ryan, is a product of the work that organizations like Third Way do.
Thank you. We paid both of them to say those things. Thank you. Well, so we do have somebody who is more recent, who has made that jump into investing in the sector. And Zach, you've invested as an angel investor in VC in a wide variety of technology sectors. Did you have some of the apprehension that Simon and Rachel have talked about? And what was your thought process as you decided to get engaged in this sector and add it to your portfolio?
I always get criticized for not being enough of a skeptic and too much of an optimist, which is probably why I'm on the panel. But thank you for being here. Really excited. It is a beautiful space, but as Todd mentioned on the earlier panel, this is not really an entrepreneur space. This is way too nice. And if any of my companies had a space like this, there would be words. But yes, so my background is in environmental science. So my unique perspective I bring to the venture industry is sort of systems level thinking. And so I've known for a long time that we need a major source of zero carbon energy. And that sort of began to form my thesis. And then obviously a couple years ago, there was the Curion investment or acquisition for $350 million based on $5 million of venture capital. So I think that kind of paved the way to say, like, that's nuclear cleanup, but it's sort of in the same space, and sort of paved the way to say, hey, these are investable. And then one of our sort of mantras inside Data Collective is you want to be investing in little r and big D in terms of research and development. And basically nuclear, advanced nuclear is ready-made for that because of the 60 years of phenomenal research that has been done in the labs that really is just sort of sitting there waiting to be operationalized. Obviously, the regulatory piece is the 800-pound gorilla there, but there seems to be some real progress and some companies that are really moving forward. So the logjam does appear to be breaking, as someone mentioned earlier. So, and does the news of regulatory progress being made, or let's say that there are efforts being done through GAIN, where you have developers that are preparing for licensing, you have companies like Terrestrial and NewScale that are kind of breaking through new boundaries. Does that type of news permeate to investors? Is there awareness among other venture capitalists that kind of play in the same general spaces as you do that these things are happening, or do you really? Is it necessary to do a better job of ensuring that they're keeping up, or that we're bringing this news to them? I mean, that information is definitely knowable. I would say the broad, the most investors are not doing deep tech investing. Just a little bit of background. Data Collective, we're an early stage deep tech venture fund. We back entrepreneurs who are solving hard problems, often using applied machine learning to disrupt deep industry verticals. And increasingly, massive scale industries that were typically the province of government are now in play for us. We have orbital rocket companies, we have satellite companies, we have in the broader investment ecosystem, new types of airplanes. These are now investable, and it's incredibly cheap to build these types of companies. And I feel that that general awareness is out there, but still, the vast majority of VCs either investing in consumer or enterprise solutions. But the ones doing deep tech, yes, there's absolutely an awareness.
And Johanna, I wanted to check in with you. For those of us who are not as familiar with impact investing, can you tell us kind of what role it plays in the spectrum in terms of getting newer technologies into the market, and if and how advanced nuclear can fit into that when it comes to impact investors that are focused on climate?
Sure. I guess my first reaction to that question is that impact investing is playing a very imprecise and ill-defined role because it is an imprecise and ill-defined term. And in general, I get frustrated by the term because I think that when we hear about investors who have an impact angle to their investments, we're seeing funds that are not structured in a way that's enabling, that's delivering a different kind of trade-off in risk and return, and that's what's really needed. So that's maybe not the answer you were looking for, but that's my first answer.
It's great education for me.
And I think where Prime plays is looking at the government-funded R&D, which is, we can talk about budget numbers and all that, but I think in the grand scheme of things, a really nice, healthy pipeline, and where venture is willing to invest. And there's a gap in the middle that, to us, looks like companies aren't getting launched and aren't undergoing the initial stages of de-risking. And that's where Prime is building a fund and investing right now. And we're specifically doing that with philanthropic capital. So we're with charitable, tax-exempt capital. And we're saying, there's about $50 billion in U.S. family foundations alone that is not being put to work to launch these new companies, largely because those asset owners aren't aware that that type of funding can be put to work to launch new companies. But they can be in a space like nuclear because they're doing a social good. Those companies that are getting launched and getting de-risked have the potential to vastly mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. And what we're doing is making a very clear pathway for those philanthropic dollars to de-risk early stage ventures that otherwise wouldn't be formed. So that's where we're interested in playing. We're bringing in later stage investors as we're de-risking the technologies, and those would be the types of investors that are calling themselves impact investors. And in general, there's a trade-off there that they're willing to make between some type of return and the impact. But in general, I think it's important when you're approaching any impact investing entity or asset owner to ask, what does that trade-off look like? And what we have found, and the reason Prime exists, is that usually that trade-off is or often I should say that trade-off is either not well-defined or not fully formed, and that when a fund doesn't have a thesis that very explicitly says we're actually going for impact, or we're actually going for impact rather than return, it's no surprise that the investments you see are not drastically different than what the venture asset class is otherwise doing.
Well, in that type of investment, those types of investment circles, are they looking at advanced nuclear, and does advanced nuclear fit into the definition or the feeling that they're looking for in terms of accomplishing something in addition to your standard return? Is advanced nuclear well positioned to actually achieve that based on what the public perception might be about nuclear energy?
So it depends based on all of the different things that we've heard about already today. For Prime, absolutely 100% yes. We're really excited about nuclear. I'm personally fired up about finding the opportunities within nuclear that philanthropy can uniquely de-risk. For us, there has to be a pathway to commercial venture dollars coming in and scaling a technology. So that's where we have to be comfortable that there are more deep-pocketed investors coming into scale. But there is certainly a population of early-stage impact investors or philanthropic investors who are excited about funding nuclear technologies.
Rachel, can I put you on the spot? Is that your experience too when you're talking to people in that space?
I would say there are tiny glimmers. I think for the most part, and I share your frustration about the term impact, I think basically it's meaningless because there are people who, yes, they want to do an investment that will have an impact on climate change, but they still want returns. They're not, there are very few actually fully philanthropic investors. I mean, I guess, but
That's not an investor.
yeah, I mean that's what I was. Yeah, it's really sort of like because these time horizons and the risk levels, many people, there are a handful of super wealthy people who are willing to just with a philanthropic hat on, say, I will invest in this because I think it's the right thing. But for the most part, it's people who, yes, we want to invest in a category that we think will, help solve climate change, but we still need, reasonable time horizons and reasonable returns. And so are investors making that bet yet? I guess I would say I hope so. There are a few. Partly it's that people are not aware this is an investable category. That's one challenge, although there are beginning to be conversations among more traditional quote-unquote impact investors like the Tonic Network or CREO, who have had introductions to this topic. But basically, there need to be more spokespeople in those communities, and it needs to gain some cachet by being more widely discussed. And that's not going to happen on its own. So I think we need to do more work there.
And I would say we're increasingly seeing impact-oriented co-investors alongside us in early-stage companies, a little bit in advanced nuclear, but I think there is more and more capital there. And these are investments that do have a return incentive, but also sort of a double bottom line. But there are more and more of these, and a lot of them are coming out of sort of the family offices of tech entrepreneurs who say, no, this needs to have an impact. So I think almost just getting the word out that this is an investable category, there is capital out there that sort of wants to make these style of investments.
I mean, I'd think I would make the argument that there are pools of sophisticated private capital that is already deploying and has been deploying for the last 5 years. I mean, you ran the numbers in aggregate and came up with about $1.5 billion. In terms of the emergence of a new technology asset class, I would say that there are private, sophisticated investors that have already engaged in the sector. And if you look at the emergence of, I think, of a lot of new technology sectors, it's that same group that typically are the leaders the investment leaders into the sector. With respect to the key point about return on investment, it is all about making your investment case. And you can find that someone has a secondary objective with respect to their investment mandate, such as impact. But you have to lead with the investment opportunity, why there is an investment opportunity today in advanced nuclear. What is the path to market? What is the path to first customer? What is the path for future capital deployment? If you can't make that case, you haven't got much of a conversation with an investor.
Yeah, and Johanna brings up a good point, and Simon, you're reminding me of this, that we're talking about these first deployments and early stage, but then where do we move beyond that? Those aren't necessarily the types of investors that are going to help scale up an industry. If we're talking about venture capital, if we're talking about family offices, so who are the ultimate investors that once some of these technologies are demonstrated and we have first of a kind, who are the investors that need to be targeted next for scaling up this industry? And do they have any current awareness that this is existing?
I mean, I would say there are groups of very big pools of institutional capital that are aware of what's happening in this sector, and they are monitoring what is happening in this sector, and they're doing their work. If you want to engage with that investor group, it's not going to happen over 6 months. So you engage early, you provide them with regular updates, you explain what's happening in the industry. You circulate research prepared by others, and that's the way of engaging with them.
So I would say that sort of we're looking at sort of the much more capital lighter weight, advanced nuclear solutions that, and ultimately, obviously, there's going to have to be, global scale project finance to bring these things to true national scale or global scale grids. But for this intermediate range that you're talking about, I'll just sort of make the analogy to aerospace, both sort of for airplanes as well as for supersonic airplanes as well as for rockets. You can make an amazing amount of progress on just sort of customer orders and actual just sort of venture or growth scale capital that's available in the market right now, and you don't need to sort of have this new asset class to make this sort of intermediate leap.
If we just put some figures on the capital number. The capital number to to first deployment of first system for some of these advanced, for an advanced reactor system is probably of the order of $1.5 to $2 billion. Now, that is not a daunting industrial project. I mean, if it's 10, 15, yes. If it's 10, 15, that's going to be, where on earth you can get 10, 15 from? But that type of number, drug development, large cap pharma, to bring one drug to market, it's roughly about $1.5 billion. So that is to put that into perspective, these advanced reactor projects are seeking that type of capital number to prove and demonstrate their commercial case. Once they've proven and demonstrated it, okay, then you can say, and that is the market opportunity. The market opportunity, $5 trillion a year of energy services is the market opportunity. That is the opportunity for advanced reactors to provide those services to the global market for industrial heat and power.
Just to add to that, I agree with Simon's point, and I think that if we can take that kind of stepwise vision of, hey, if we get a billion and a half demonstration, that can unlock that larger pool of capital. If we can, as a community, bring that then down to that next level of what are the tens of and hundreds of $1 million chunks from an investor perspective to understand what the de-risking steps are, it's very valuable. And that's where it ties in with your previous question about gain and some of these other opportunities. I'm really excited by the innovation, that's the institutional innovation that's occurring at national labs and elsewhere. And I think it's there's a confluence that we can put together, bringing those resources to bear toward bite-sized de-risking steps. But I think we as a community need to do a better job of articulating what those are for the investors.
Well, and so having some initial deployments will certainly set a tone, a more confident tone for the industry. But do you envision there will still need to be public sector engagement in terms of scaling up? And of course, in the regulatory side, that will always be helpful for companies that are trying to scale. But in terms of maybe building on what's being done at the R&D level with GAIN, we do have some assistance at DOE. DOE has really been stepping up with a lot of these things, including the potential for use of loan program office funds, so loan guarantees, production tax credits to maybe help with initial deployments. But beyond that, what do we need to see from the federal government in terms of helping unlock that private capital at a larger scale?
I guess my initial reaction would be additional integration between the NRC and the innovation community. So the funded R&D and integrating that into the licensing process in a very intentional, technology-driven way would be huge.
Can I just inject here that under that question is, so there is this totally new structure and role that we're expecting government to play in what has been a government-directed, very top-down system. Now, to interact with a bottoms-up entrepreneurial sort of private sector space actually requires government to operate differently, the national labs to operate differently, and that doesn't happen on its own. So when people want to enable this space, they almost always only think about how to invest in it. And I just want to say that actually the biggest bang for your buck in this space right now is to help support the policy and advocacy to help both conceive and then advocate for some of these system changes that eventually will enable the entire sector to be able to flourish and will help attract more private capital.
So what are some examples where you've seen that working successfully?
GAIN initiative. I mean, that came out of work that groups like Third Way and its partners, CATF and others, helped conceive of and helped through conversations with folks at DOE and the national labs and the White House. That was one of the results of that kind of work.
Excellent. Well, so because some of the folks on the panel, we just have a minute left to go, but there are some folks who have not focused on the advanced nuclear sector as carefully in terms of a broader portfolio of technology sectors they look at. Any comparisons, anything that you want to, that stands out to you in terms of other sectors that could be a good example for advanced nuclear to follow in terms of scaling up and outreach to investors?
I think this question is directed toward me.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I should just stare.
Yeah, so I until recently was the director of tech to market at DOE's Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Office. So we did a lot of thinking around this for other areas. I think the three things pop into mind. I know we're in lightning round mode, so I'll just say them quickly. One is testing and validation resources. We talked about that a little bit with GAIN. Can do a lot better, but it's really exciting and important institutional innovation. The second would be new financing instruments, thinking about PPA-like mechanisms for the nuclear industry. And then the third would be integration with large corporates. The corporate world in the energy sector is just waking up to the idea of open innovation and how to engage with external innovators, more so on the nuclear side, but there's a lot of opportunity there.
Lightning round. In terms of the innovation on the funding side, we've even seen proposals. I'm not saying it's investable. We've even seen proposals for initial coin offerings paired to advanced nuclear.
Got it.
So cryptocurrency, because it's cryptocurrency is effectively a libertarian, has a very strong libertarian bent. And what's the one thing that the government can control, but that the miners cannot? It's their power source.
Well, we've had several people in this room have written about that, I know for a fact. So, well, thank you to everybody in the panel, and we really appreciate your time and attention. And I want to just give everyone a note. We're going to have a coffee break right now.